It's Cinemassacre's Kong-a-thon. Today we're going to talk about the Toho duology, which includes King Kong vs. Godzilla and King Kong Escapes, both of course made by Toho, the Japanese company who makes the Godzilla films. But first, I should mention there actually existed another set of Japanese Kong films made back in the 30s. Both of them are now lost. There only exists photos. The first was a silent comedy called Wasei King Kong. It was released in 1933, the same year of the original Kong duology. You could say it sure was trying to capitalize on the success. And they must have been so self-aware that the plot is actually about a man trying to capitalize on the success of Kong. He watches the movie and gets the idea to put on a theatrical play. He's trying to make money so he can marry his girlfriend by getting the approval of her father and proving that he's wealthy enough. The screenshots or publicity photos look really cool, but it's disappointing to know that it's just a guy playing an ape. Not that it would be real anyway, and the film's lost, so it doesn't matter. The second film, called King Kong Appears in Edo from 1938, was released in two parts, kind of like Kill Bill Volume 1 and 2. It was a period piece drama with a complicated plot involving a father trying to find his kidnapped daughter. The man responsible uses a trained ape named King Kong to do his capturing. Other than the name, the creature doesn't seem to have anything to do with Kong and looks more like a generic Sasquatch or Yeti. In some of the promotional photos, he appears to be giant-sized, and in others, he appears human-sized. Nobody really knows for sure. Apparently the suit actor, who was also the special effects technician, said in a 1988 interview that it was a giant ape. That would make this the first Japanese giant monster, and what's even more interesting, the same guy worked on the original Godzilla suit. Hopefully one day these films may be discovered, but it seems unlikely. Now on to the Toho films. The next time Kong made a big comeback was in 1962 with King Kong vs. Godzilla, the American monster versus the Japanese monster, the East versus the West. This was one of the all-time classic monster mashups, up there with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. This was the first time both Kong and Godzilla appeared in color. I've already reviewed this film during Monster Madness Godzillathon, which was back in 2008. Holy crap. I focused mostly on Kong fighting Godzilla, but I hope I didn't give the impression that the whole movie is one big monster battle, because it's not. The monsters only fight at the very end, aside from one other brief encounter, but still, the whole movie is entertaining. It reboots the Kong universe and places him on Faroe Island rather than Skull Island. Here, the head of a TV network sends two bumbling men over to capture Kong to gain publicity and boost ratings. But Kong gets loose during transport, and meanwhile Godzilla breaks free from his iceberg, keeping continuity with the Godzilla franchise. Of course, they cross paths and take an immediate dislike for one another, but hey, let's back up. I didn't mention Kong fights a giant octopus, which is a combination of both real and fake ones. They use stop motion when the tentacles are picking up people, and some kind of rubber version that attacks Kong. This one doesn't move at all and looks like it's wrapped in cellophane. Maybe because it is. It's even more hilarious than Ed Wood's Bride of the Monster. That one at least had strings. The only good octopuses back then that I can recall are from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and It Came From Beneath the Sea, which all use different techniques. When you see the real octopus, it's obvious that it's authentic. There was actually 4 of them, and I don't know if it's true, but there's some trivia out there that the special effects director, Eiji Tsuburaya, ate one of them. Well, he sure got a lot of use out of that, didn't he? His dinner was one of Kong's opponents. Could you imagine being able to say, I eat my special effects. Stan Winston ain't got shit. That T-Rex from Jurassic Park was pretty awesome, but did he eat it? Probably not. Tsuburaya, man, fucking eats that shit! Kong, of course, is a rubber suit in the Japanese tradition of effects. But man, he looks like roadkill. It's awful, but I wouldn't want to have it any other way. He's always got this silly look on his face, and he does a goofy dance, not to mention he's hooked on drinking berry juice. They had to jack him up to Godzilla's size just so they could fight. When discussing the original film, Kong is said to vary between 18 to 24 feet tall, depending on whether he's on Skull Island or in New York City, but Godzilla has always been much taller than that. In the original Japanese Godzilla film, he's 50 meters, which would be 164 feet, but in the English dubbed version, they say he's over 400 feet tall. Whatever the case, they're now the same height and evenly matched. But, oh wait, Godzilla breathes fire. Well, that sucks for Kong. The fight starts off exactly as you'd expect, with Kong getting his ass handed to him. There's a great moment where he throws a rock and Godzilla flings it back with his tail. Then there's that weird stop-motion kick. But things take a turn when Kong is struck by lightning. They established earlier that electricity makes him stronger, and this is when the fight really starts. Kong swings Godzilla around by his tail and shoves a tree down his throat. Then there's the part where they both look like hand puppets. It's weird. It's just a bunch of laugh-out-loud effects, one after another. It's great. I love this fight. As I mentioned in Godzillathon, I said it could use a remake. As much as I'll always enjoy the silliness, it would be neat to see them have a serious rematch using really good effects. And since then, that's finally been announced. But we still have until 2020 before we finally see it. Hopefully. It will probably be too heavy on the CG, but still, with Kong fighting Godzilla, how can that ever get old? Of all the Godzilla films in Japan, this one holds the highest number in box office attendance, and I'm not surprised. When I was first getting into these films before the internet, there was an old rumor that Toho made two endings to the film. In the Japanese version, Godzilla wins. In the American version, Kong wins. I first heard about it in the Crestwood House books, and it drove me nuts. When the internet came out, I remember asking on message boards, trying to track down the Japanese version, but it turned out, all along, it was total bullshit. In both versions, the monsters both tumble into the ocean. Kong is the only one that surfaces. He swims away, the end. But there is one tiny difference, and only an audio difference. When it says the end, in the American version you hear Kong roar, but in the Japanese version you hear them both roar. I can only speculate that this might have something to do with the origin of the double ending myth, or somebody just completely let their imagination run away. It was originally published in magazines in the 60s and persisted in news articles and even a Trivial Pursuit board game. There were plenty of other differences with the films. Universal handled the American release and added scenes with American actors. They also used a lot of music from their horror library. If you're a Universal Monster fan, you'll notice cues from The Wolfman and Creature from the Black Lagoon. But there's still a lot of original music. I especially like the songs the island natives perform to Kong to make him go to sleep. All around, it's a fun film. As I mentioned in Godzillathon, there were connections with Frankenstein. I'd like to explain that a little better. Originally, it was conceived as King Kong versus Frankenstein and was proposed by Willis O'Brien, the original Kong effects artist. It said he envisioned the movie as having Kong fight against a monster created by Dr. Frankenstein by stitching together different animal parts. The idea was shopped around, and eventually Toho decided to make it, but replaced the Frankenstein monster with Godzilla. Kong is energized with electricity, which is just like the Frankenstein monster, so it's possible they may have used bits and pieces of the original idea and put Kong in the Frankenstein monster's place while swapping Godzilla to the other role. It's just my own speculation. Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster was originally written to be a Kong film, but he was replaced with Godzilla. When you watch it, it makes perfect sense. Godzilla is discovered on an island, and he picks up a young woman who he sort of falls in love with, I guess. You don't see Godzilla doing that. Not to get sidetracked, but as far as the rest of the Frankenstein stuff goes, they made Frankenstein Conquers the World featuring a giant Frankenstein monster who fights against Baragon. There is a sequel called Frankenstein's Monsters, Sanda vs. Gyra, also known as War the Gargantuous. It's about two hairy monsters that fight each other. In the Japanese version, it's explained that they both spawned from cells of the Frankenstein monster, but in the American version, they changed all mentions of Frankenstein to Gargantuous. And from that point on, it started a trend where in the German releases, they started changing the titles of Godzilla films to include Frankenstein. Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster became Frankenstein and the Monsters from the Sea. Son of Godzilla became Frankenstein's Monsters Hunt Godzilla's Son. Destroy All Monsters became Frankenstein and the Monsters from Space. Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster became Frankenstein's Battle Against the Devil's Monsters. Godzilla vs. Gigan became Frankenstein's Hellspawn. Is that weird or what? As far as I know, there's no big changes to the films themselves. Frankenstein doesn't actually show up. It's just something they did with the titles. Frankenstein must have been really popular in Germany, or at least more familiar of a name with German audiences. They wanted to have a name that was more well-known. I don't know for a fact if it was any more well-known in Germany than in the rest of the world, but I stated in Godzillathon that it made sense because the Frankenstein monster is from Germany. I will back up that claim. Many people point out that Mary Shelley was not from Germany, she was from England, but I was talking about the character in the book. Frankenstein, who's born in Italy, travels to Germany where he creates the monster, meaning, yes, absolutely, the monster is from Germany. Mary Shelley herself traveled to Germany before writing the book and may have gotten inspiration from the real-life Castle Frankenstein, which means Frank of the Stones. There was a guy named Johann Dippel who was rumored to have robbed graves and experimented with corpses and happened to have been born at the same castle. This could be a coincidence, and it's possible Mary Shelley might have not even visited the castle, but there's enough to connect the Frankenstein monster with Germany. Now let's get back on track with King Kong. There's more alternate titles, but they start to steer more towards Kong now. The German version of Godzilla vs. Megalon was called King Kong, Demons from Outer Space. In this version, Jet Jaguar is called King Kong. In Godzillathon, I said there was a rumor that there was altered dialogue to suggest that it was actually King Kong inside the robot suit, which is hilarious. How would Kong even fit in there? But it seems there's no truth to that. It was only a rumor, as I said. King Kong was the name only and nothing else. The German version of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla was called King Kong vs. Godzilla. Boy, that would have been confusing. So does that mean Mechagodzilla is King Kong? And here comes my favorite one. Terror of Mechagodzilla was called Konga Godzilla King Kong, the spawn of the devil. So not only is there Kong and Godzilla, but we have Konga and the fucking devil? I wish there was something more to it than just the title, because I would have totally watched that. It was common for different countries to rename movies depending on what they thought would make the most money. But anyway, let's move on to Toho's second Kong film, King Kong Escapes. It was known in Germany as King Kong, Frankenstein's Son. This film is not a sequel to Kong vs. Godzilla. It's actually based on an animated Kong TV series by Rankin Bass. It's about an evil scientist named Doctor Who. That's right, just like the TV series. In the German version, his name is Dr. Who? No, really, I mean, guess who? Dr. Frankenstein. That was easy. Doctor Who is a great cliché villain walking around in a black cape. He's kind of like the Asian version of Christopher Lee. He's trying to dig for a radioactive material known as Element X. He's working for Madame Piranha, who presumably wants to use the weapon to create nuclear weapons. They keep mentioning she comes from some certain country, but they never explain what country it is. Anyway, to dig for the element, Doctor Who creates a giant mechanical King Kong. It could have been any other type of machine, but I guess it's just more awesome for it to have the likeness of a giant ape. Meanwhile, there's a group of explorers on an island who have almost the exact same experience as Carl Denham and company. They encounter the real King Kong, who picks up the girl and places her in a tree while he fights a T-Rex, so it's almost like a remake of the original Kong, for just a bit. He even uses the same finishing move, tearing the dinosaur's mouth open. The Kong suit looks slightly better than in Kong vs. Godzilla, meaning it looks like it came from a Halloween store rather than being found flattened on a highway. It has sort of a cartoonish face, looking goofy in its own way, almost like this time it was actually meant to be funny. His opponent is called Gorosaurus, who makes another appearance in Destroy All Monsters. Afterwards, Kong fights a serpent, which is a reminder of the scene in the original Kong where he fights a plesiosaur. I bet most people think it's a giant snake. I admit it took me several watches to notice the fins. Anyway, Mecha Kong, who is actually known as Mechani Kong, fails the digging mission because the radiation from the element X makes the robot malfunction. So Doctor Who captures the real Kong and uses him instead, controlling him under hypnosis. When he digs, the radiation causes him to revert back to his normal self. He goes on the loose, or escapes as the title says, and Doctor Who sends Mechani Kong after him. In the end, the two Kongs fight and you get your money's worth. It may not be on the same level as Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, but it's still a satisfying battle. But when you stop and think about it, as far as the plot is concerned, it's only a coincidence that they end up fighting. Mechani Kong wasn't created to fight the real Kong in the first place, it was created to dig for element X. It just so happened they ended up fighting. The whole film doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's very entertaining. It has a little bit of a James Bond type of feel. I don't have as much to say with this one. There's no more Frankenstein trivia to get me sidetracked. But anyway, next time, it's more rubber suits. Let's talk about the Kong duology from the Dino De Laurentiis company.